Hi, ladies. This week we're talking about self-regulated learning. This is really the last chapter in the book that I want you to read, and it is particularly important when we talk about adult learning and transformational learning, which is mostly with adults, because adults really do and have learned how to regulate for themselves, how to learn, what to learn, and those who haven't have not had the foundation of strategies to help them best develop how they can learn successfully and how they can achieve their own learning goals. So that's what we'll be talking about this week in this chapter. I've only done a few slides for this chapter. A lot of it is review, as each of the chapters on a learning theory has touched on what they believe about self-regulation. So we'll just kind of really review that. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the instructional strategies, mainly because I did not think they applied to your fields. So if you have questions after this video related to the reading, please do ask me on email, and I'd be glad to go over whatever you need me to go over with you. Okay? Great. So, as I stated, each of the theories that we've covered have mentioned something in the chapter about self-regulated learning. So, as we kind of review what each of them said, know that across those perspectives, there are some foundational assumptions that all of those theories or perspectives have about self-regulated learning. So the first is that this really involves the student's active participation, behaviorally, cognitively, metacognitively, and motivationally in their own learning and in their own performance. So although the chapter talks about, and we can talk about strategies to teach people in how to best actively engage in their learning, it really is self-directed, and their own sense of control or agency is important when we talk about self-regulated learning. This is a dynamic and cyclical process, and certainly, as mentioned in several of your posts, feedback is an important part of self-regulated learning, so that we can make the proper adjustments, so that we can make those adjustments timely and kind of switch gears, change strategies, whatever you need to do to become successful. So it really is a dynamic process. Throughout the theories, they really talk about how one's own goals for learning are really important in terms of helping direct activities, pick which strategies are going to be most useful or most helpful as people learn. And then for each of the theories, there is an emphasis on motivation and really people's own choices about what their goals are and how best to achieve those. So those are some foundational assumptions throughout the different theories. So from a behavioral perspective, they really look at self-regulation as how people choose among a variety of behaviors, and then their ability to defer immediate reinforcement and delay it for wherever their learning goal is, whatever it is they hope to accomplish. And really, it's not a reinforcement that they get right away, but are they able to delay that gratification or reinforcement so that they can achieve their learning goals? And in this theory, they talk about three processes involved in self-regulated learning. That's self-monitoring, or the ability to really pay attention to a certain behavior, and either through recording frequency or recording intensity, using that monitoring to make adjustments. Self-instruction is the second process involved, and that is what is the environmental conditions that we need to pay attention to, so that we can do the behavior that will lead to that enforcement. And then self-reinforcement. That's how people give themselves consequences, positive and negative, based on their performance, that will hopefully increase the likelihood of future performance and future responses. So when I was reading this behavioral self-regulated section, I really thought about some of the adult learning that happens that uses this process. As I think you've heard before, Weight Watchers is really behaviorally focused from a behavioral perspective, and I thought about having to track the foods that you eat and how often you eat them in order to then say, well, I need to make some choices here about whether I want to eat this amount or these kinds of things to get the long-range results that I'm looking for. Excuse my dog, y'all. Okay, second was social cognitive theory. Here they make special emphasis on learner choice, although that's foundational in terms of active participation on all theories. Social cognitive theory really, it's a critical component, and they, very similarly to the behavioral perspective, give 3 self-regulation processes. So they call it self-observation rather than self-monitoring, but it's really about how you determine whether or not your behavior will help you meet standards, whether those standards are for what's a pass, fail, what's an A, B, C, and then reacting positively or negatively as you judge your own behavior, your own accomplishment on the basis of those standards. It also talks about self-judgment. That's comparing your present performance level with your goal. So if my goal is to get my graduate degree, then how am I doing right now, and will how I'm doing get me to where I want to be? Or do I need to step it up? Or am I doing just fine? Do I need to find another way to get things done more effectively so that I can reach that goal? And then self-reactions is monitoring your goal in a way that will help you to continue to put forth the effort and the energy that it takes to get there. So what's going to help me be motivated to continue to make progress? Then in this overall theoretical perspective, Zimmerman talked about a 3-phase model, really, where he talks about what we do beforehand, kind of the forethought, the goal planning, the processing that happens, and then performance and the control that we take over our own performance or our own behavior related to studying or whatever strategy it is that we're using, and then a process of self-reflection so that you can really judge where you need to make corrective changes or shift in your strategy so that you know whether or not it's working. Pintrick did a similar model with forethought. He expanded on forethought being the planning and activation phase. So what is it that I want to accomplish? What's the best way to accomplish that? How am I going to plan to get where I want to go? And then his second was monitoring that, So this is what I set out to do. This is what my goal was. This is what I was thinking. How is that going? Do I need to make some shifts? Do I need to do some self-correcting? Taking control of that. And then the phase of reaction and reflection. So very similar to Zimmerman's 3-phase model. In the information processing perspective, self-regulated learning is really the equivalent to metacognitive awareness, or what we call metacognition, which is really the whole thought process behind why we're doing what we're doing and when we're doing it, and whether or not that's effective. So Wynn and Hadwin developed a model where they talked about 3 necessary phases and 1 phase that's optional. So the first of the necessary phases is defining the task. So what is the task that I have to do? Clearly defining whether it requires task conditions, or what task conditions it requires, and what cognitive conditions it requires, so that I can define what it is I need to do. And then designing a goal and a plan for attaining that goal. Thinking about and strategizing what kinds of strategies will allow me to achieve my goal. And then the optional phase is adaptions, where students make adaptations to their plans based on their evaluation of how successful they are. So kind of the same self-reflection phase that other theorists talked about. And he called that optional because if you did a good job, then maybe you don't have to do that phase. So here are some of the learning strategies under the informational processing perspective that they talked about, how we would make sure that those strategies stuck and that information was able to be stored and retrieved from long-term memory. So we remember rehearsal as a strategy, repeating information, underlining, summarizing. So going through with our highlighter and going over those highlighted areas is one method of rehearsal. They also talk about elaboration, how to elaborate on the information, so that we make those network connections that information processing talks about. And some of the strategies there are using imagery, using mnemonics, using questioning so that you can help relate what you're learning to what you already know, and using note-taking. Organization is another strategy. Again, using mnemonics is a way to organize a lot of materials so that you can kind of sink it into long-term memory and then be able to retrieve it. Grouping, categorizing, outlining, information mapping. Those are all strategies to organize the information that you're having to learn. Monitoring, self-questioning, rereading pieces that you're not clear about, checking consistencies in your understanding, being able to paraphrase what it is you're reading or what it is you're learning in your own words. Those are some self-monitoring strategies. And then a need for some effective learning strategies. How do you cope with test anxiety and other anxieties? Making sure that you continue to have positive self-efficacy, and creating a positive environment for learning. How to manage your time so that you're not trying to learn under stress or distress. So the last theoretical perspective that talks about self-regulated learning is constructivism. And as you remember, constructivists really are about the self-regulation of learning as a whole. They don't just have one section about it, but really that's the whole idea of constructivism, that people, individuals, construct their own reality. They define what learning needs to be, what they value, what's important to them to know, and how to construct that. But they do make two key assumptions in that regarding self-regulated learning, and that is the importance of sociocultural influences, and the importance of the implicit theories, the implicit concepts that people learn and tell themselves about their abilities and their capacities to learn. So they talk about how individuals reflect those processes that are taught and valued within their culture. For instance, in the Native American culture, there is a value about narrative and the whole storytelling, and that you give people time and space to tell their stories. It's a very narrative culture, so how that is valued as a regulatory process. That the primary mechanisms affecting self-regulation are the tools of language, and that zone of proximal development, which is again that time or that gap between what someone knows by themselves and what they need others to help them expand upon. And then that self-regulation also depends on the learners being aware of what are socially approved behaviors, and that shapes the strategies that they use. In terms of implicit theories about themselves and others, people's beliefs about their competence relative to those of their peers, whether or not that's true. We form these implicit theories about whether or not we're as good or as competent or as smart as our peers. Beliefs about what contributes to success in different domains. So you might believe that girls don't have an aptitude for math or science, and that can contribute to whether or not you develop and put forth the strategies it needs to be successful in those domain areas. And then implicit theories about agency and control, and whether or not we attribute our success or lack thereof to ourselves, to other people. We see that we have a part in that, or that we are a victim, or not in control of those things. So all of those things make a difference in terms of how people regulate their learning and how they come up with what their learning goals are. And then there's a section about instructional applications. I think throughout the book really we've looked at what are some ways that we can teach students strategies to help them learn more effectively and efficiently. That may not be as much related to adult learners, as I've talked about before. The book relates a lot to children, but you may find in your classes that there are students, that there are adults who have not learned strategies to help them maintain information, comprehend information they're getting. Maybe their reading comprehension is not good, or they have test anxiety. So you may find that there is a need to kind of use some learning strategies and teach those learning strategies in the context of your the content of your classes. So I hope this has been helpful. Again, if you have any questions, please do let me know. Thanks.